Welcome to the Reinvent Nuclear Security series, where this session we'll be looking at big opportunities for new partners. Now, this is the third roundtable we've had in this 6-session series. We started out looking deeply at what new technologies might be coming on the horizon here in the next 10, 20, even 30 years that could change the game in the whole field of nuclear proliferation and nuclear arms control and everything related to that. Really interesting opening session. We had a second session a couple weeks later where we looked at how could the national nuclear weapons labs be repurposed both to maintain kind of security around nuclear weapons and defense against nuclear weapons, but also to kind of take off on other directions of other great challenges facing the nation at this time. This week we're going to turn to more like what can partners outside that kind of national security establishment, how can they actually help move the ball on this really important issue? And to do that, I'm going to basically turn this over. As the founder of Reinventors here, I've been working very closely with the host of this series, Erica Gregory, and she is the executive director of N-Square. N-Square is a group that we're partnering with on this series. It is a really interesting group that is essentially backed by 5 of the leading peace and security funders in the United States, frankly, throughout the world. We're talking the MacArthur Foundation. We've got the Hewlett Foundation. We've got the Carnegie Endowment, Carnegie Corporation of New York. We've got the Plowshares Fund, and we've got the Schell Global Threats Fund. These 3 very important players have come back behind this N-Square group to try in the next couple of years to really shake up the space in this nuclear security thinking and to really get some fresh new ideas and some new forward motion in this very critical space. Now, so I'm going to hand it over here to Erica, who will then drive the conversation. Erica, it's to you. Oops, you got to unmute there, Erica.
Okay. Hi there. So thanks so much, Pete, for the introduction. I'm excited about today's episode. I've been looking forward to this one because we started this initiative with a core hypothesis, which is that innovation around non-proliferation and nuclear security was really going to require the energy and the innovation culture and process know-how of some new partners. Yes, that's the private sector in our minds, but it is also social media partners, social activists. We have a lot to learn from folks who may not know very much about this space yet, but once they do, we think they have a lot to offer in new technologies, new ways of doing things, new expertise. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce, or have all the folks in the roundtable introduce themselves, and then I'll come back and say a little bit more about what we're trying to do today. So Brian, why don't we start with you?
Certainly, thank you, Eric, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you. I've been watching this series with great interest, and I commend you and the others involved in what's been a really great series so far. So hopefully we don't vomit on our shoes and we continue the positive trajectory. As you mentioned, my name is Brian Finlay. I'm the vice president here. I have a think tank here in Washington called the Stimson Center. We're a bit of an oddball think tank in that we not only work to generate what we hope is going to be the next big idea to address some of the most pressing global security challenges, but we are just as likely to be found here in our offices thinking big ideas as we are on the borders of Kenya and Uganda managing trafficking challenges, or frankly sitting at the board tables in New York making a business proposition for nuclear security. And that really, I think, gets at the crux of our work and hopefully our contribution to the roundtable. And it's really looking at very specifically what is the business proposition and who is that breadth of actors that can and indeed must be involved in addressing this particular challenge, an issue that we've been working on quite steadily for the past decade.
That's great, Brian. Looking forward to hearing a lot more about that. So let's go to Leslie, and then we'll go to Tamara and
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I really appreciate it. So my name is Leslie Dewan, and I'm the CEO of Transatomic Power in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Transatomic is commercializing our design for a new type of molten salt reactor that can consume existing stockpiles of nuclear waste. So it's able to break down the uranium and plutonium and other actinides in the used nuclear fuel. My background is on the engineering side. I have a PhD in nuclear engineering from MIT with a focus on computational nuclear materials and use nuclear fuel storage and remediation. And my particular interest now is figuring out designs for new types of advanced reactors that are inherently proliferation resistant. So designs that are inherently secure either due to their fuel form, their core design, or other factors like enrichment level.
Oops. Erica, you got to unmute there quickly.
There we go. Tamara, how about you?
Thank you, Erica and Peter, for having me. My name is Tamara Patton, and I'm a nuclear weapon policy specialist and researcher at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation in Austria. And my research focuses on emerging technologies for verification, or in other words, the tools that countries can use to make sure that everyone is following through on their commitments and agreements under treaties and conventions and agreements. And when people talk about nuclear disarmament, one of the first questions asked is, could we ever verify with enough certainty that no one is retaining a secret nuclear capability? And I think a big part of getting to low numbers and eventually to zero is having good answers to those questions. So here in Vienna, my work straddles the worlds of policy and industry, in that I engage regularly with international organizations and states, organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, but also with emerging companies that are developing new tools that could be potentially useful for verification needs. And very briefly, as far as the types of technologies I focus on, a lot of my work right now focuses on commercial satellite Earth observation, where there are a lot of companies developing some pretty groundbreaking capabilities. And I also work a lot with 3D modeling, visualization, and virtual reality as tools for system design, simulation, and training.
Great. And now, last but not least, we have Kate.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Kate, and I work at TED conferences on the partnerships team. And I work primarily in conferences and partnerships between education and philanthropic partners. Right now, I'm working with Skype in the Classroom, and we're working on a project where we get speakers with really great ideas, and we Skype them into classrooms around the world. I've also worked with the TED Prize with Charmy and Gooch, JR the artist, and Sylvia Earle on her Mission Blue project. So what we're working on at TED through these partnerships is to identify people with really great ideas and then taking a more hands-on approach to bringing these ideas to life. And then through TEDx, we have a grassroots network of organizers who help us surface ideas from local communities around the world.
That's great. So Pete, we have a quick note to the audience, I think, and then we'll jump right in.
Yeah, and I'll just for those that aren't familiar with me, my background, I mean, I'm the founder of Reinventors. We've been in here about several years here. We've been working closely with all kinds of partners, whether it's universities, companies, nonprofits, foundations now, all kinds of ways to get folk to bring smart innovators together to work on complex challenges and to essentially help reinvent the world around us. So in terms of this theme today, I might be actually contributing a little bit more than normal because we actually have a lot to say about how do we bring partners together and kind of pull together interesting coalitions of people around making things happen. So I might contribute as well. But before I do that, I just want to say no one's as smart as everyone. This is our little theme that we always say around Reinventors here. And there's, for folks watching, whether it's on the site, the reinventors.net site, or whether it's in our G+ environment, or whether in other environments as well, YouTube and others, you can comment. We do have people kind of keeping an eye on your comments and questions, and they will cycle some of the best ones to me, and I can actually get it into the conversation here if it's relevant. Even if not, we'll basically be packaging up a lot of the your insights as well as the insights of the people on this roundtable into our final videos, final write-ups, and the packages that'll start pushing out into the web next week. So feel free to give your ideas. We really value them. Erica, back to you, and why don't we jump into the conversation?
Okay, sounds good. So there's some urgency around the conversation for me today, and let me just say a little bit about why that is. There are a few things that we know here. We know that there are obviously increasing tensions and violence between Russia and Ukraine as we're having this broadcast, although hopefully there's a ceasefire in place. We know that those tensions are increasing across the Middle East. We know that terrorist groups have said that they want nuclear weapons and will use them if they get them. And given the training and expertise they have in explosives and engineering, we can't assume that that's an idle threat. We are hopeful, but we're unsure that the U.S. and Iran will reach a deal that freezes portions of Iran's nuclear program in exchange for decreased economic sanctions. At the same time, we know that federal funding for non-proliferation efforts is going down in the fiscal year 15 budget. We know that there are significant cuts to the National Nuclear Security Administration's international security programs, and also for the first time the Department of Defense's cooperative threat reduction effort. We also know that funders, philanthropic funders like the Hewlett Foundation, are exiting the field for various reasons, which we can go into later. So we have a question behind all that, which is what happens when the threat increases and funding for new solutions decreases? There are some positive points of light for us to look at. For instance, there are emerging venues for cooperation between the federal government and the private sector. Rose Gottemuller, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, we know is invested in those partnerships. And we know that there are real opportunities for the private sector at this moment. So I'm going to come back to the framing question, and then I'm going to turn to you, Brian, to help us understand what this means a little bit more deeply. And the question is, what would motivate new partners to invest the time and resources required to address nuclear issues today, non-proliferation and increased security from nuclear threat, and what are the barriers to entry? So, Brian, let's hear from you. We know that you're focused on the public-private partnerships piece, mitigating international security threats, especially working with insurers and reinsurers who have a critical role to play in this systemic problem. So let's hear what that looks like. What are those partnerships like?
Yeah, it's a great question, Erica, and it's really fundamental. I mean, if you pick up any think tank report, if you read a government official speech, you mentioned Rose's good efforts at the State Department. There is a sense that that nuclear security really has changed fundamentally since the dawn of the nuclear era. There was a time, believe it or not, and it's hard to reckon back to those early days when governments really did hold the means of production, if you will, in terms of nuclear weapons. And that, as you just pointed out in your introduction, and again now, has fundamentally changed. And it's fundamentally changed because of changing technology, because of privatization, has pushed those technologies from public into private hands, because of outsourcing, offshoring, and all of the kind of modern elements that make up our global economy. And it has meant many good things, obviously, that have come out of globalization, but it has also, again, pushed those capacities to build nuclear weapons into really more and more hands, in more countries, in more corners of the globe than at any other point in our atomic history. And it's outpacing, certainly, the ability of governments to grow. So we read about the need for public-private partnerships. The unfortunate piece is that we really don't understand, in many cases, what that actually means. I mean, what is a public-private partnership, particularly when it comes to nuclear security? And I think there are really two fundamental challenges. One really does get at your point regarding motivations. What motivates private industry to behave the way they do? But the other piece I think that is important is understanding who those partnerships need to be with. And that, I think, is really the fundamental starting point. When we talk about nuclear security and public-private partnerships, we tend to think of the far spectrum in terms of the actors in the private space that are involved. It's either the technology innovators and manufacturers that may be producing a dual-use widget, or on the far end, the end users who ultimately receiving it and potentially using those widgets for nefarious purposes. But in that wide space in between, what I call the global proliferation supply chain, there are many, many actors that have a role potentially in disrupting acquisition of a nuclear weapon. So to your point, it's those insurers that underwrite shipments, that it's the financial industry that may be financing activities, either in developing technologies or ultimately moving those technologies. Perfectly legitimate companies whose activities and services may be used for nefarious ends. It's port operators, it's shipping companies, it's air freight companies, it's freight forwarders, and so on and so forth. So it's understanding who our partnerships need to be with, A, and I would suggest to you it's all of those various sectors. But B, to your point as well, it then comes down to figuring out how we motivate action. And we have a tendency, I think, in academia and the think tank world and even in government to assume that that our industry partners will want to engage in nuclear security because it's the right thing to do, and many of them do. But I think we need to understand as well that while they may be motivated certainly by our common security, they ultimately have to service the bottom line. It's what does the end of the quarter look like in order to keep your company afloat or in order to keep your company profitable that would allow them to even become partners of ours. And so I think that we really need to start with that question. It's the question of how do we both identify what the global security challenge is, in this case security that needs to be serviced, and find that intersection of interest within that penumbral area, if you will, with private industry that allows them to meet their prime objectives, which is building market share, which is building profit, and so that's, I think, really the question that we need to be wrestling with, and there are many examples of how we can do that.
So that's really helpful, Brian. And I remember when we talked about this most recently, you said something about, it's whether you're moving fissile materials or you're moving underage girls. They're traveling on the same carriers through the same ports. And so those people who are thinking about global supply chains really have an important role to play in solving not just this problem, but multiple interconnected problems. I don't know if you want to comment further on that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's a great example. The recent shipment that was intercepted several months ago in Panama. It's a shipment, as you know, that was traveling from Cuba back to Pyongyang. Now, in this case, it contained conventional weapons, but it could certainly have contained items of WMD interest. And we know that those shipments have certainly occurred. It's those same ships that happen to be carrying those conventional components. We know at once also traffic drugs. We know that they traffic humans. We know that they traffic conventional arms of other sorts, and so forth. And so it's looking at that, again, intersection of interest. So we may think that a company that is involved in air freight, well, why would they be interested in nuclear security? Why would a private insurance company be interested in nuclear security? Why would a freight forwarder be interested in nuclear security? But the fact is, they're all interested in all of the above because those issues certainly have a direct interaction with their ability to service the bottom line.
So, Brian, Tamara, I'm going to turn to you in just a moment. And Brian has mentioned a couple of things. There's a lot that we could unpack here. But certainly, there's a strand here in what he's mentioned about those technologies that are involved in managing global systems. In this case, we've been talking about moving things from point A to point B. But Tamara, you're pretty tuned into the kinds of technologies now and over the next, say, 5 or 10 years that'll be really instrumental in helping us in keeping the world safer and more secure from nuclear threat. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what those technologies are and who those partners are who are coming to the table now.
Sure, thanks, Erica. It's a bit of a tricky topic to try to cover in 1 to 2 minutes, but I'll do my best to flag some of the highlights. I think when we talk about verification systems in the context of non-proliferation that are supporting the international organizations that are tasked with these responsibilities to detect and to report on instances of proliferation. The systems have gotten progressively better and better and better over the years, but still they have a long way to go before we can be truly confident in them. I think we've seen cases like Iraq and Libya and Syria, where there have been instances of proliferation that we didn't detect in time, and that we are striving to be able to detect earlier in order to be able to create a more effective international response to these issues when they crop up. And I think some of the few major technology areas when we look at that issue of quicker detection, both in the context currently of non-proliferation verification systems, but also looking forward to eventual incorporation of these technologies for arms control and for nuclear weapon reductions. I think one of the areas is this broad area of information technology, when we're really just talking about the hordes of information online in terms of news, documents, photos, media, reports. You see a lot of different statistics about how vast that information source is growing. And there's a lot of activity around how can we make better use of it for earlier detection. And I think that there's been a lot of outreach between international organizations and these kinds of companies that are developing around this challenge of big data. And maybe that's something we can dive into more later in the conversation. But just to keep going through the technologies, the other thing I wanted to flag was in the area of satellite imagery. This is, I think, a really exciting area, looking at some of the companies that are coming onto the field. We're seeing sort of a shift in the model of the way commercial satellites have traditionally been deployed, where we're seeing more companies that are developing constellations of smaller, cheaper satellites, companies like Skybox, like Planet Labs, that are creating this novel capability of being able to monitor large areas of the planet on a more frequent basis. And that's something that has never existed in the public domain, and international organizations tasked with non-proliferation are actively looking at that capability to see how it could potentially be incorporated into these systems. And I think the last interesting area that I wanted to flag is the area of mobile sensors. There's some really interesting research going on in terms of not just dealing with the information online, but also the devices that are capturing the information as these sort of sensor networks around the world, whether we're talking about mobile phones, whether we're talking about stationary weather sensors, climate change sensors. There's a vast amount of information and resources that could be tapped in that area as well, that, again, international organizations could potentially use for verification.
So just to build on that for a second, in one of our last episodes, we had somebody talking to us about sensor technology, and essentially the prediction that it's certainly within our lifetimes, and maybe just within the next couple of years, that we could assume that we will be able to track everything everywhere. I mean, that may be a bit of an overstatement, but that with sensors embedded in everything that's moving around through those ports that Brian was talking about earlier. So I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about what you think the prospects for sensor technology are in non-proliferation efforts, and what's potentially most interesting on that scene. And then I have a lot more questions for you too, but we'll come back to them later.
Sure. I think it's such a new area that it's really sort of a sky's the limit sort of situation when we look at sensors. I mean, of course, the obvious model that we should be looking to is the immense system that has been built up by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. It's a massive network of all different types of sensors meant to detect nuclear test explosions. And it serves as a model for something that has already been established, that's already been built, that's already begun to enter practical use for our field. And I think when we it's helpful to sort of translate what we've learned in the process of developing the international monitoring system for CTPTO to potential other mobile sensor networks. It really gets into tricky issues, looking at different types of sensors and different use cases, because I think, for instance, dealing with mobile phones is going to have a lot more sensitivity and legal issues than, say, government deployed weather sensors. I think a really especially interesting area is looking at these citizen networks of sensors that are being deployed by voluntarily by different organizations. I think one of which is Safecast, that was involved in monitoring the radiation following the Fukushima disaster. And that network is still active, it's still growing. I think it has a lot of valuable lessons for the way that they've used it for nuclear safety. I think it has a lot of valuable lessons for ways we can apply it to non-proliferation and potentially to arms control. But again, it's something that really needs to be picked apart in detail in terms of what we could actually do and what different models would look like.
So in just a second, Leslie, I'm going to come to you as an entrepreneur in this space, but I wanted to give Brian a chance to weigh in, given that he started us on a strand about global supply chains, and we're now talking about sensor technology, and obviously those are deeply related. So I just wonder, Brian, if you have any quick comments before we turn to Leslie.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to, Eric. Look, it's important, I think, for us to look a little bit back as well, really since the period of 9/11, where, at least in terms of our response to the perceived growth of the WMD threat as a result of that one terrorist incident, and we know, of course, that that was not, in fact, the case. It sharpened our focus and our minds, and it also opened our wallets to a lot of I think, innovative technologies. A lot of those have been extremely helpful, and a lot of those have not been so helpful as well, or have been less helpful than promised. And so, while I think that it's very, very important for us to remain focused on what innovative technologies, sensors are one very, very important of that, I think. But we also have to recognize, I think, that and you noted this, I think, at the outset, Erica, that the non-proliferation budget is going like this, not like this, and it's going like that for a reason. It's not because the threat is diminishing, as you pointed out rightly. It's that our wallet is getting slimmer and slimmer. And so, while we, I think, may make a very strong and legitimate case that investments in non-proliferation should be growing, that our investments in sensor technology should be growing rightly, I think an equal case is being made that we shouldn't be cutting food stamps, and that there is a growing challenge related to climate change that we need to be focusing on, and our government's resources. So the point is that resources are being stretched, and while I think it is important to focus on some of the most important sensor technologies and other technologies that can help us and engage in a public-private partnership effectively, I think we should be, and I think you got to this as well in your conversation, that looking for, if you will, this dual benefit approach, that how can these technologies not only help in non-proliferation and nuclear security, but how can they also be applied elsewhere? And to me, as we look at the most effective technologies since 9/11 to address nuclear security, it's those technologies that have that dual benefit, that have really brought private investment to the table in a way that our government dollar just simply cannot be stretched to service any longer.
Okay, so thanks for that. And so now let's just kind of switch gears for a moment and hear from the other side. We've been talking a lot about new partners, and we have one in our conversation here, in the form of Leslie Dewan, who is exactly the kind of young entrepreneur that we would hope to attract to this space. So Leslie, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what it is like engaging around this issue as a private sector entrepreneur, and what you think the potential value propositions might be for a young company like yours.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to build more on this idea of how new technology can drive and help nuclear security issues, especially with respect to the large number of new nuclear startups that are being started within the U.S. and Canada. So I think as of right now, there are about 24 new private companies that are all developing new types of nuclear reactor designs, many of which are venture-backed or backed by other investors. And what's so fascinating to me about it is that these are all different varieties of reactors, all different base technologies. Many of them have significant nuclear security benefits, some have drawbacks, and many of them, even more interestingly, are in the very early days of their development. So there's this potential for these new designs as they're being made to be able to integrate in nuclear security features that would then be propagated as these designs are commercialized. And it's something that, in talking with investors, investors are extremely interested in backing designs that have very good nuclear security profiles, just simply because that opens up a wider market. Because right now, well, basically, you don't want to limit your design to states that already have nuclear weapons. That kind of mitigates that security case. You want to open it up to all of the countries that need it, all of the countries that can potentially pay for it. So it's something that investors are extremely concerned with, making sure that the technology itself is inherently proliferation resistant.
So Leslie, can you talk about how you develop use cases for when you're talking to the investors that support your work, maybe even some of the naysayers, as I'm guessing you've probably come across some of them. So what are the important selling points for investors who are thinking about moving into this sector?
So I'll start with Transatomic's reactor in particular, and then move out more broadly to other features that are attractive to investors for these reasons. So Transatomic's reactor is able to consume the uranium and plutonium and other actinides that are in existing stockpiles of used nuclear fuel. So we're able to remove the risk from the existing used nuclear fuel. That's something that's very attractive. And gives us a good foothold in countries that already have these stockpiles of used nuclear fuel. Beyond that, other features that are very attractive are designs that can be sealed for long amounts of time. Like Bill Gates' TerraPower, their original design was a reactor core that would be sealed for 50 to 60 years, which then makes it very proliferation resistant because you aren't physically able to get at the fuel. Another feature that is sort of at odds with having a sealed reactor is making a reactor that requires only very low enriched fuel. So this means that A, you don't have to enrich it as much, so you aren't bringing material your material is as far away from weapons grade as possible. And secondly, you don't need as many enrichment facilities, so you're lowering the number of facilities total for that lower enriched design. The tricky piece here, just to emphasize, is that generally when you make a reactor design that's sealed for a long period of time, that requires higher enrichment levels. If you have a lower enriched reactor, you have to generally replace the fuel more frequently.
Right,
so figuring out, allowing the reactor design companies, like a few of them I think are figuring out what direction they should go in, which path in between those two extremes they should choose that will give them the best non-proliferation benefits possible.
Okay, so I just want to point out that so far what we've heard, if I were somebody looking at this space and listening to this conversation, I'd say, okay, so we've seen opportunities for new partners in looking at the movement of materials around the globe in an increasingly global system, as Brian pointed out. We've looked at opportunities to address the life cycle concerns of nuclear materials. This is what you're helping us look at right now, Leslie. Tamara has begun to talk about improving our capacity to verify diplomatic or political solutions, treaties, verify that treaties are being observed, and monitoring those nuclear sites around the world for those state actors who have nuclear weapons. So all of those potentially have both problems and opportunities associated with them, and I'm hearing you mention that there are opportunities for new partners across that whole spectrum. I wonder if anybody would want to add anything that I have missed so far from that list. Anybody want to jump in here before I turn to Kate for a whole different slant on this?
Can I just mention something in regards to Leslie's point here, which is in actually talking to Leslie and laying the groundwork for Leslie, I'd love to know to what extent in this new kind of next generation nuclear energy field, to what extent do they see themselves as symbiotic with essentially a potentially a symbiotic with essentially getting off nuclear weapons? Like there's a transition potential there of demobilizing nuclear weapons and using that fuels and other kind of things to actually repower the country. Because I must say, in our second roundtable here, there was a lot of talk about how the nuclear labs could be thinking next big challenge, climate change, and the next big challenge, national challenge or global challenge around climate change is going to have a lot to do with energy and scalable energy and energy that's not related to antagonizing global warming. So anyhow, to what extent do you think as a group kind of like, oh, we could be the linchpin that could, or we could be one way to kind of transition between eras or something like that?
That piece is something, thank you, that's especially interesting to me. I think a number, at least 4 or 5 of the 20 or 30 new nuclear companies out there are focusing specifically on figuring out how to use down-blended weapons uranium or plutonium to power their reactor designs. It's something that's made a little bit tricky, and because in order to access those materials, you do need an explicit partnership with the government. So that's something that would be a bit of a barrier for these smaller companies because they aren't able to get that sort of partnership in place before they approach investors. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem where you can't really, you can develop a design that is capable of using these materials to produce electricity, but it can be hard to make that business case to investors unless you are able to already have that sort of government partnership in place. But it's something, there's just an enormous amount of energy in these materials. So technologically, it makes a great deal of sense if you're able to set up that type of public-private partnership ahead of time.
Great. Any follow-up question from you, Pete, on that?
No, that's helpful. Just keep moving it here. But I think there does seem to be this, when we think structurally and long-term here, that feels like one really rich structural juncture between the field of nuclear security and the field of nuclear energy and a lot of climate change. It feels like, wow, a lot could be done there with the right levers being pulled. But
yeah,
anyhow,
I think Brian wants to jump in on this too. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to get back to your question and actually build off of Leslie's point as well, because it's a really good one that was embedded in there as well. You know, you mentioned in terms of what industries should we be looking at, and it does go beyond all of those that we mentioned already. It's the financial sector, as you mentioned yourself, Erica. It's the insurance industry. But Leslie makes a really important point that we all need to hear. I think loud and clear, and that is the challenge that private industry has in partnering with government. And that, at least in my experience, has been really kind of the fundamental challenge in many of these partnerships. Well, there may be good intentions on the side of government and good intentions on the side of industry, until we can identify or at least bridge over the challenge of pace at which those two sectors operate. I think there is a massive stumbling block in terms of building these sorts of partnerships. Well, government processes, as we all know, are generally extremely slow, even in the best of circumstances. Industry is moving necessarily at a much more rapid pace. And so while we might conceive of developing a partnership, to government that may flourish in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years' time. But for industry, it's got to flourish by the end of the quarter, by the end of the second quarter. And so until we can better align these time frames or figure out a way to do it, building an effective partnership is extremely challenging.
So very interesting, and I just want to emphasize that in these partnerships, of course, we're talking public-private partnerships are core, they're key, but they're not the only kinds of partnerships we could be looking at. So, for instance, I'll just suggest that there could be new ways that philanthropy partners with the private sector. There could be new ways that we incent private sector actors to work together across sectors that may be non-obvious. But I think what you're all beginning to point out is that there may be some interesting ways that the technology sector, the financial services sector, the insurance sector, the carriers, the people who move people and things around the world, all have shared interest in some of the problems and opportunities in this space. And maybe there's an opportunity actually just to figure out new ways to bring those folks together. So let me turn for just a moment now to Kate, who I think you're going to be coming at this from quite a different angle. And we look at TED as an interesting partner in this space, not just around nuclear non-proliferation, but of course around other big systemic social issues. So Kate, talk to us a little bit about what you see as a potential partner in this space.
So when it comes to these types of big systemic issues, we think about it in two ways. One way is we identify individuals that we think can make an impact on them, and we provide them with the platform and resources and even sometimes the training to deliver their message. And we do that through a fellowship program and also through the TED Prize. And then another way that we think about it is education. We had a saying, radical transparency, and our goal was to put as many ideas about big systemic issues online as possible, and these videos would get millions of views a lot of the time. But over the past couple of years, we've taken a more hands-on approach to some of the ideas that have come off of the TED stage that we think can make a really big impact on society. One of those ideas, for instance, is Brian Stevenson's talk about the prison system in America. And so we've taken a more hands-on approach through, in a lot of ways, through our partnerships with foundations, where we've helped them identify individuals through the fellowships network to advance some of their entrepreneurial ideas, or we've gotten grants for TED-Ed, our new education platform, to develop videos to be used in classrooms that distill ideas that aren't often taught in classrooms because they seem really complicated. But through TED-Ed, we've gotten a lot of funding to help distill ideas from CERN scientists, for instance, to be shared in classrooms, and also to contribute to career pathways for students who don't know that certain careers exist. And so through TED-Ed and partnerships with the Reinvent Foundation and the Ford Foundation, we've done work to not only simplify big ideas, but also to help develop the next group of entrepreneurs and young people who are interested in these problems that might seem abstract.
That's great. So what advice would you give to us in terms of this issue, given that we're just at the early stages of thinking about new ways to use media, the social movement space that you're developing through TEDx, for instance? So talk to us a little bit more about how you would advise us as a potential partner in this work.
For us, what we think about all the time is the way that you want to deliver a message. And we really believe in an emotional impact and talking to people simply but also really personally and connecting it to issues in people's everyday life. And we actually worked with Charmian Gooch on Schell companies. She was a TED Prize winner last year, and that is a type of topic that doesn't immediately have an emotional appeal, but we worked with her to pick out stories where Schell companies, the fact that they existed, made them, they weren't able to be convicted for crimes. For instance, there was a building fire and the constable because they were through Schell companies. So that story in and of itself was resonated a lot on social media, and we also worked with a lot of media partners. Actually, the New York Times is now picking up some quotes from Charmian Gooch, and it sort of started the conversation on Schell companies and how they can affect particularly buildings that people live in every day.
So what does it take to get, let's take TED as an example. You're obviously here from TED. What does it take, what kinds of resources are required to incent TED to take on an issue, let's say, like nuclear security? How do you choose what you do and don't work on?
Well, we listen to ideas from members of the TED community. We also think about ideas coming off of the TED stage that have resonated on social media and also just from TED.com. So that we pay attention to what people are watching and listening to. And then we also accept applications for people. If we think that people have a really strong story and that we can help advance it, that makes a big difference for us in terms of figuring out who we can partner with.
All right. Tamara, do you want to ask a question?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to underline what Kate is saying in terms of this importance of getting the message out effectively in terms of the technological needs in our field. I think we don't do a very good job of that, unfortunately. I think it's a theme that's come up a lot in this Reinventors Network in the video series, that the opaqueness of this field in terms of what, sort of how the public sees it from the outside. And in terms of speaking to verification technologies, I think nuclear, sorry, there's a little bit of feedback, but nuclear experts, they tend to know where to look in terms of figuring out what government needs are, in terms of figuring out what international organization needs are, but they tend to be pretty buried. In the sense that you have to know which website to go to and where to dig within that website to find out what kind of needs and what kind of partnerships and what kinds of technologies are being sought. And it's when you combine that with this other issue that Brian and others are discussing about this difficulty of forging government and industry partnerships, I think in the context of planning an event that my center hosted last year, where we brought a number of companies out to Vienna to talk about getting involved in this field, that's a question that comes up over and over again, is who is the ultimate customer, and what are the steps to getting from beta testing to implementation? You know, what is the path? Because obviously when you're dealing with government contracts or you're dealing with international organizations, it's a very complex legal process for how new technologies get adopted. And I think if that is not made clear as part of the message for that, you know, there is a path to implementation, then companies can be, you know, and innovators can be immediately turned off from getting more involved in this field. So I think it's definitely something we can build on.
I'd jump in here. Can I just jump in a bit here?
Sure.
Just something. I mean, particularly coming off of Kate's discussion and reinforced by Tamara there. I mean, when you think of partners, there's the obvious kind of private sector company partner kind of thing, which I think is one of the first places you think about. But I do think there is this partnership. What I think TED and TEDx has kind of demonstrated, and there's a lot of us kind of playing in this space of smart ideas, smart video. There are so many people around the world with, you know, so much talent and so much to give, whether or not they're heading their own exact company, which is an obvious thing they can do. But there's so many other kind of expertises, and there's so many other folks that have the pieces of the puzzle of a lot of the big challenges going on there. And I do think what's interesting about TEDx, I think, again, is, you know, how when you went to the TEDx situation, it's just like, boom, you just watch this bottom-up kind of explosion around the globe, essentially, of a lot of smart people in a lot of different places that were tapping into an opportunity to actually talk about meaningful ideas and smart, you know, solving problems and, you know, socially relevant ideas. And I think, you know, for all the kind of counter evidence of, you know, crazy cat videos and kind of silly stuff going on, there's also this really interesting opening for smart, serious, complex discussions around really important things. And I think, you know, we're finding it here at Reinventors, and anyhow, there is an appetite out there, and that when there's not just an appetite, then somehow those partners, just loosely linked as smart people with a lot of talent and a lot of entrepreneurial energy out there, wow, how can they be harnessed as partners? That's another kind of more amorphous but interesting kind of potential partners going forward. Anyhow, maybe Kate has some more to think about that too.
Yeah, Kate, let's hear some more from you on that.
Yeah, so just to elaborate a bit on TEDx, and Peter alluded to this earlier, TEDx emerged because people asked us to allow people to license the TED brand and hold their own events. It wasn't something that we had originally thought we would ever do. TED started as a really elite gathering of people, which in another way serves a really interesting purpose to gather a lot of industry leaders together, and we have partners come in and hold workshops and discussions, and that can be really fruitful. But TEDx, on the other hand, is completely grassroots. And I think there's an interesting correlation between a lot of community organizing that in recent years has popped up, like Black Lives Matter, for instance, is a recent example, that has tied hand in hand with a lot of TEDx, which involves a lot of community organizing. It takes a lot of effort for a TEDx organizer to put these events together, and the sheer scale of how many events we've seen in the past few years is really a testament to the hunger, I think, around the world for community organizing. And not only does it bring people together, but it also provides the speakers with content that they can use to advance their ideas. So when there's a really good TEDx organizer, they train their speakers to deliver the message really well, and then those speakers can use the talks as evidence that supports their work. And one good example of this is Juliana Rotich, who started Ushahidi, which is a crisis networking mobile app, and she started out as a TEDx speaker, and now she's a TED Fellow, and she has received a lot of corporate and also foundation sponsorships and opportunities coming out of the talk that she gave.
So it's interesting because I think if we just contrast some of what Brian talked about earlier, Kate, with a kind of an opportunity to very intentionally look at how the alignment of new partners, the interests of new partners align with our interests around nuclear non-proliferation and safety and security. That's an intentional approach, and I hear you talking about something which is potentially much more inductive, bottoms-up, messier, just as global in its reach and in its possible effect over time. But it's in a sense an opposite approach to finding and energizing new partners.
Well, there's an interesting element with TEDx. We have worked with the Gates Foundation in the past to focus really specifically on health. So we held a lot of TED Exchange events in different regions that the Gates Foundation was working on to hold talks just about healthcare and how it impacted all of these local areas. And that was really interesting because these talks used a lot of policy and theories that the Gates Foundation was working with, but they really focused on how it impacted the people in the room specifically. And not a lot of those talks are talks that are going to be really popular on TED.com, but for all the people there, it served to sort of codify meaning in terms of what people are doing in a big way with healthcare and how it matters to them and what they can do about it. So that's one way we take a more kind of straightforward approach to addressing topics using the grassroots TEDx platform network.
Okay, that's great. And Leslie, I think you had a thought here, huh?
Absolutely. I just wanted to talk a bit more about TEDx and to thank you for making that available to everyone. So one of the very first public talks that Transatomic gave was at TEDx New England back in November 2011. And going into it, it was something that I was very uncertain about. It was just a few months after Fukushima. It was a Boston-based audience. I wasn't quite sure how they would feel about nuclear power, but the TEDx organizers were so good at working with us, with me, at figuring out a way to put out this message about nuclear in a way that would address people's concerns, address the pieces that they felt were most interesting, and it ended up being a presentation that I think connected very well to the audience. So I agree extremely strongly that that TED and TEDx and the other related groups are crucial for reaching a broad audience and helping address people's issues and helping to tap into the enormous opportunity that's out there.
That's great. That's so there's a lot more that we could add here. I'm about to switch gears, but before I do, let me just ask if anybody else wants to jump in on this strand. Okay, so let me try this framing and see if this is helpful, because really I'd like to look at the next few minutes almost as a brainstorm. And so the framing I would give you is this. The best estimates that we've heard so far are that if we were to get to total multilateral disarmament, it would probably be not till the year 2045. So whether you agree with that framing or not, let's just go with it for the purposes of this conversation and say that means that we're 70 years along a timeline already that has, by most estimates, another 20 or 30 years left at best. So given that, here we are in 2015, we're looking at the next 20 to 30 years between now and 2045. And if I ask you all to give us advice about what we should be thinking about in terms of attracting new partners to these problems, who should we be looking at? Where should we be looking? What should we be paying attention to? Not for today, but for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Well, that's a great question, Erica, and clearly by the deafening silence, clearly. Sorry, yes, I'm sorry. It's a really tough question to grapple with, right? Because we have, we are all thinking, in time horizons of the end of the year and 5 years often. So if you look at that 10 to 20 year horizon that you've just, what are our priorities? Well, if we really want to dedicate ourselves, and if we really believe that we are on that pathway to zero, to the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, clearly there are a subset of activities that are going to have to occur along that pathway. And first and foremost, though, while we may be seized, at least in the popular media, by the threat of a terrorist acquisition of a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear device, clearly one of the fundamental elements of moving to zero is going to be ensuring that that other countries do not obtain a nuclear device. So there are many different pathways that we can go to, but let's try to restrict it to that public-private partnership space that you've defined for conversation. If we're looking at that space, it really is, I think, essential that we do more of what we're doing now, and that is attempting to disrupt the acquisition pipeline of countries like Iran and like other countries that may be seeking to develop nuclear weapons. And it's also trying to build effective barriers to the proliferation of technologies in countries that already have those technologies. So let's set aside Iran for the moment, because that is an extremely challenging issue, which we could talk 90 minutes for have a completely separate discussion around. And let's focus instead on those countries that have the capacity to proliferate technology. Now, once upon a time, as I started the conversation, that those technologies were really restricted to a few, a very small number of governments that have the capacity to really contribute to the proliferation supply chain. Now that world has changed, and so now we can see technologies to the earlier point. In terms of the democratization of innovation, well, that democratization of innovation is occurring on both the legitimate side as well as on the nefarious side. And so, technology, nefarious technologies can be developed and manufactured as easily today in I like to say in Belmopan as it is in Berlin, or as easily in pick your country, the United States and Jamaica, or in Chile. And so, I think that we need to begin to address not only the motivations of private industry, but also the motivations of those governments, because ultimately it is going to be that partnership in terms of developing common cause to break the proliferation situation. The question for me is, how do we motivate a shipping company? How do we motivate the government of Chile to step up and invest more resources in prevention? And it's not an easy task. You pick a country, your average developing country in Africa, that is struggling with a malaria outbreak or HIV/AIDS, a country in South Asia whose girls may not be getting primary education, and we go in and say to them, very important that you elevate this issue of nuclear security as your top priority. Well, if I were sitting in their shoes, I'm not sure I would be especially receptive to that argument. It's the same argument that we're making, I think, with private industry. How do we preach to AIG? How do we preach to Bank of America? Or how do we preach to Maersk that we need to elevate nuclear security above meeting and servicing the bottom line? So I think that if we try to restrict this discussion to public-private partnership, it's I think trying to focus on not just the partnership between our government and industry, but also the partnerships potentially that are operating in countries of the developing world, where in truth the proliferation supply chain is perhaps most acute because the controls are at their roots. Just one anecdote to close. It's interesting to me that as we go and travel across the developing world and talk about nuclear security, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Sub-Saharan Africa, or whether it's Latin America, governments in these countries at one time wanted to engage with the United States. They wanted to hear from USAID. They wanted to hear from the Pentagon about these issues. Today, they don't want to hear from them. They want to hear from Google. They want to hear from Intel. They want to engage with General Motors. It's the corporate interests that have really kind of taken a lead in servicing kind of their core objectives and their high priority issues. So the question for us is, how do we begin to develop an agenda that gets our companies that are the crown jewels in so many ways in terms of the higher priority needs of countries on the proliferation supply chain to actually begin to carry water for us. And that solution is, as you have said so many times, Erica, it is in building common motivations between these multiple actors.
That's a really helpful overview, Brian. Thank you for that. I wonder if that has stimulated any questions or thoughts from anybody. I know, Pete, maybe you had your virtual hand up.
I'll just a few quick little things. If you're looking big picture like that, 30 years out, 70 years behind us, it feels to me you got to go to the big structural shifts, like a breakthrough at a technology or a current technology that can be scaled up rapidly, a structural change like a bottom-up kind of open sourcing of this problem so that you've got a million flowers kind of trying to solve it rather than just kind of very super secret kind of government kind of bureaucracies or something, or generational shifts. I mean, really empowering a next generation of totally different thinkers, like a lot of them we have, kind of represented here today. I mean, I think you guys are putting your fingers on these bigger structural things. It feels to me like those are the real longer-term breakthroughs that will really change the game on this and really make this. If we are going to get rid of, nuclear weapons, it's going to be a world historical moment, just like it was a world historical when we started them. And it's when you get those big shifts like that, you got to have big levers that you're playing, not tweaking around the edges on refining current policies. That would be my just thinking and the brainstorming thing of like, what will really set off these much more broader structural things that we don't really know how they're going to play out, but they may well be where the answer lies.
Leslie.
So one other piece that I'd love to talk about that I think is relevant here is related to the proliferation of nuclear technologies around the world being moved out of the United States. And it's very relevant to the new reactor techs that are being developed in North America. So right now there's no clear, rapid regulatory pathway for prototyping or commercializing the advanced reactor designs in the US. And this has led to a lot of the reactor startups, including Bill Gates' TerraPower, deciding to go overseas to do their prototyping and testing, going to China or to the Philippines or Malaysia, for example. And that's a very concrete example of literally advanced nuclear reactor technology being moved out of this country into places that are outside of the US's control. And so I feel like one structural change that would be very logical to make would be to make a clearer regulatory pathway for these advanced reactor designs in the US so that the companies will be incentivized to stay here, retain their investment here, keep their technology here. And there are some efforts that are proceeding in this front. The Advanced Reactor Licensing Initiative, that's a joint effort between the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That's making a great deal of progress, and it's extremely important work, but I think it's something that really a lot of effort needs to be focused on that to keep the tech in its early stages in this country.
So you raise a really interesting point, I think, Leslie, and it makes some of us have wondered whether it isn't time to think about setting up innovation zones in the United States, much the way we have them around healthcare and we have around education, with developing hubs where there are either federal incentives, tax incentives, and so forth to innovate, to bring partners together who wouldn't come together otherwise, and essentially create new markets for some of the solutions around non-proliferation and security that could come out of those kinds of forced and incented innovation zones. I wonder if you want to build on that some more, Leslie, as an entrepreneur. What would something like that look like to you?
Absolutely. I think something like that would be extremely logical and could do a great deal of good for the world. Thinking about it first from the perspective of nuclear power production, I think a logical place to do that would be perhaps a partnership with a national lab, a public-private partnership that could bring private investment to that site. You could have a test facility there within the US for these advanced reactor designs. And beyond that, I think that finding a way to...
okay, that's great. Well,
oh,
yes.
Sorry, my microphone's cutting out a little bit. I apologize.
No, Pete. Okay.
No, go ahead, Leslie. Continue. You were doing fine.
Oh, sorry about that. My video feed was cutting out, so I wasn't sure if I was still coming through. And I think moving even beyond nuclear power into other types of detector technology, I think there's so much opportunity to bring the smaller companies together that are working on these designs and establish hubs to be able to focus directly on this work.
Sounds good. So Brian, and then I'm curious, Tamara, how you're thinking about all this. Obviously, you're not sitting in the United States just now, but I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this in a second. So first, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. It's a really important point, a really important part of the discussion, I think, and Leslie raises an important point that I think that we tend to put ourselves, at least in the nuclear security and non-proliferation space, in a bit of a kind of an intellectual box when we're conceiving of solutions. It's been very humbling for me to break out of this cloistered community that I've lived in for the past 20 years or so, working on these issues, and begin to engage with entrepreneurs and business types, because they think about the problem in a completely different way. But again, getting a little bit back to one of Leslie's points, the solution set so often for these challenges is not the one that's on the top of my policy brain. It's the obstacles that these folks hold up. It has to do with U.S. patent law, or it has to do with some arcane restriction in the Energy Act of 1954 that is preventing some innovation from occurring. That's driving intellectual innovation overseas, or that's driving manufacturers. That it's oftentimes not what we in the policy community may think of as the central problem. But it is some, as I say, arcane little widget that is resting in a regulation that is, in a common practice, that's inhibiting change. It's the really kind of boring stuff of nuclear security. I mean, I suspect certainly Tamara has forgotten more about these technologies than I will ever know. And I suspect that as she goes through and engages with technology innovators, she, as I am, and probably much more so, is continually reminded by these individuals of, again, that completely separate space that most of us know nothing about, that is truly the inhibitor for the cellular breakthroughs that Peter was referring to.
That's really interesting. So let me ask you, Brian, do you think that there is anywhere a good top view of this whole problem space, including the kinds of structural barriers to innovation that you're beginning to talk about right now. Is there any place, potentially as a new partner in this field, is there a place that I would be able to go to really understand the domain in all of its complexity and understand where maybe the opportunities are and where the barriers are?
Yeah, well, that is a great question, and unfortunately, I've been looking for about 15 years for that, Erica, and I have not found it. Now, you are much more talented than I am, so maybe you'll find it much more quickly than I can. But it is, you know, it's elusive, and I think it's elusive because the industry, if you will, is now just so diversified. You know, as you said, it's insurance, it's the financial industry, it's the shipping industry, it's the dual-use technology innovation industry, which is huge in and of itself. So because there are so many different potential access points, there really has yet to be, to my knowledge, a comprehensive look at what the barriers are, because the barriers to a shipping company are very different to the barriers to an insurance company. Let me give you one example to this. You may recall, right, at the end of the Cold War, there's a great book that was written by, was then a correspondent for the Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post about Victor Bout. It went on to become a Hollywood film, A Merchant of Death. This was a story of Victor Bout, who was, they believe, special forces in Soviet times, who essentially lost his job at the end of the Cold War and acquired a number of heavy lift Soviet aircraft, in which he started his own shipping company. And his motto was that he would ship anything to anyone, anywhere, at any time. And indeed, because of that, he actually became both a subcontractor to, and in some cases, embarrassingly, a direct contractor to the United States government, moving war material into theaters of battle, as well as into sub-Saharan Africa in terms of aid. When these two authors interviewed the Pentagon and the State Department, who had contracted and subcontracted Victor Bout, respectively, their answer was, look, this was the only person that could move this product into the theater for us. As they investigated a little bit more widely, of course, they found that, in fact, that was not true, that there were many U.S. companies and international companies, very legitimate companies, that were bidding on those contracts. But Victor Bout could undercut them at every single corner, because he would ship the material in, and in the case of, for instance, Afghanistan, load his aircraft with opium and ship that opium back to Eastern Europe, to Western Europe, and elsewhere around the globe. And so he was raking money in on both sides. The legitimate companies simply could not compete in that space. So there were a dozen different minute restrictions in U.S. law that ultimately came to bear that actually prevented the U.S. government from breaking those contracts. Once they had signed the contract, they were essentially obliged to keep working with Victor Bout. They could not break the contract. In other cases, there were restrictions in terms of the State Department and the Pentagon from actively engaging with legitimate companies because they were more expensive than Victor Bout. So that's just one example, I think, of how these layers of regulation and layers of past practice are inhibiting us from, in some cases, doing the right thing, even when we want to do the right thing.
Wow. So, Tamara, I see you nodding your head. Curious to hear what you're thinking about.
I'm afraid I don't have good things to say. I'm just going to sort of build on the challenge that Brian kind of laid out there. And I think that something that we have to keep in mind when we think about progress toward strengthened non-proliferation capabilities and progress toward being able to verify arms control and disarmament in the future is that this is an issue that's much bigger than the U.S. Moving to zero is something that we've understood first has to incorporate Russia. Ultimately, will incorporate the rest of the P5 states. Moving on to incorporate other outlier states that possess nuclear weapons, and even beyond that, many assert that the international community will not be satisfied with nuclear weapon state possessors just verifying themselves, but that other countries and the wider international community will also have to be involved in that process. And it's something that I've learned, I've kind of had ingrained in my mind as someone who came from an academic background in the US and is now working in Vienna amongst these multilateral forums, is that we have a lot of good ideas for ways to move this field forward, but ultimately we have to get the buy-in of other countries as well in order to implement it. And so, for example, I want to come back to this issue of message and of language when we talk about the needs in this field, and specifically bringing in new technologies, new companies, new innovators. Anyone who studies verification and technologies for non-proliferation knows that there's this sort of dancing line between what is seen as verification and what is seen as spying, or what is seen as monitoring, and something that is too invasive, that intrudes on a country's national security, and that there has to be a lot of attention paid to how we portray new technologies so that we land on the side of this is something that's going to be good for verification and this is why we should implement it. Because, for example, I've seen companies come to Vienna and give speeches to international organizations and get completely ripped to shreds by countries, a few countries that oppose the implementation of these technologies. And of course, you know, I'm sure in some cases companies get discouraged by that, seeing this as a long road ahead rather than the sort of rapid implementation that we would like to see and that we would like to be able to apply with getting involved in this field. And so I think that that's something that NGOs, that universities, that think tanks need to pay attention to, is that when we try to bring in new companies into the field, we need to be communicating to them the political sensitivities and sort of the right language for approaching this task. For example, international organizations are very careful never to say that they are monitoring, rather that their technologies are evaluating capabilities. So when you look at a site with satellite imagery, you are evaluating capabilities. You are not monitoring it. And, you know, and it's things like that that could, I think, make a lot of progress if we bring in new partners that have that awareness in and can sort of, you know, move a little more effectively within this field and getting new ideas to the implementation stage.
Right, so that's a sobering reminder of just how complex and interwoven all of these problems are. And yet you also, Tamara, point to something that I think is important about the need to just continue doing better storytelling and more differentiated storytelling that communicates an understanding of the different motivations and desires and needs of different audiences, just in the way that anybody building a case for social action or a business case would have to do, identifying a gap, understanding who the audience or beneficiary is, figuring out where the benefits lie and what the risk is of not getting involved, and figuring out how to communicate all of that in such a way that your audience comes along with you. That continues to be a big issue, it seems to me, in this sector. Is that, I see you nodding, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in terms of this timeline that you laid out of going to 2045 and seeing that as, you know, maybe a unicorn type of deadline, but something as a goal nonetheless, that I think there's a need for more sustained engagement. I don't think there's ever going to be a quick fix, dramatic, groundbreaking innovation that's going to, you know, make everything right and accelerate us toward this goal. I think it's about creating a sustained process between industry and policy, and realizing that this is going to take decades and cycles of technological brainstorming, of multilateral negotiation, and ultimately implementation toward these goals. And I think, just getting a little more specific on that issue, one of the gaps in our field is that there, especially, speaking to verification technology, is that there isn't really a clear front door or a clear meeting place for participants to facilitate that exchange. And I'm talking more about an environment that is accessible to the non-expert community. Because, for example, we have forums like the Institute for Nuclear Materials Management Conference. It's an incredible event that happens every year that brings together the expert community in nuclear non-proliferation. But there's not a whole lot of engagement with outside partnerships, and it's not a really accessible forum to people and to innovators and companies that don't already know very well a lot of the issues in the field. You also have annual symposia like what the IAEA does. It has its Symposium for New Technologies for Verification. The CTBTO also has a similar annual symposia that they've begun to implement in the last few years. But again, these are somewhat smaller events, and they're more tailored to the specific needs of that organization, which is good, but I think it doesn't stretch sort of as wide as it could in terms of casting a wider net and bringing new companies to the field and making that discussion space more accessible.
So we have just a few minutes left in this conversation, but you've just been so helpful, Tamara, in setting something up, which is that it sounds like from this conversation, neither do we have a way of getting up above this whole set of nested problems and issues to get a top view of it, nor do we have the kind of front door, I really like that expression, front door, that would allow people who are non-experts to really engage with the issues. And I can't think of anybody in this conversation who probably has greater insight into how to do that, Kate, than you and the other folks at TED. So curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so TED overall, that's what we do. We tell stories based on expertise, knowledge, and people who are really in-depth, knowledgeable thinkers in whatever field that they're working in. And so that's most TED Talks are people who have written books and research papers and people who are really in the weeds on all these different topics. And this way we train them to deliver a TED Talk is all based on a very, very broad audience. And so the storytelling is sort of the biggest part of what we do. And it takes months and months in order to do that. And I think that that's something that is not always so obvious to people, how much time it takes to deliver a 20-minute talk that people will understand. And that's just a really, really sort of personal, one-on-one type of work that we do with speakers. We have a lot of speaker trainers who have worked in TV production, but also who have a lot of degrees in psychology. I mean, that's sort of the level that we're working with in terms of every speaker that we have. Sorry, am I frozen?
No, you're fine.
You're fine. Keep going. And that takes a lot of time, and then also a major component is the way we edit the videos. And so that has been a process that has taken almost a decade for us to perfect. TED actually started in 1984. And editing these videos has made a really big difference in the way that we communicate information to a really broad audience. But another thing that we're working on to take like more academic ideas and to keep sort of the lesson-like quality of them is through TED Ed, which I mentioned before, but we're really focused on taking the work of educators and retaining that education quality in these videos that you can take and make into lesson plans. So the very platform it's called ed.ted.com, the platform allows you to customize and flip these videos and turn them into lesson plans, and the videos are it's a broader than K through 12 audience, but it's very education focused. And so that's the way, those are sort of the two ways we're thinking about distilling really complicated ideas.
Wow, that's very helpful. I'm getting a little bit. Great. Okay, good. It's not quite solved. Okay, so let me just jump in nevertheless. So we have just a couple more minutes left, I think about 5 more minutes left. And so I'm going to ask you all 2 questions. We're going to do this kind of rapid fire. All right, so I'm going to tell you what the 2 questions are, and let me say that I'm going to come first to Leslie, just so that you can have a moment to prepare, Leslie. So my 2 questions, we'll just do one at a time. The first one is, what have you heard from somebody in this conversation so far that you think is really important for N Square to think about more deeply? All right, so what have you heard from somebody else in this conversation so far that you think is important for us? And then the second question is going to be, if you could wave a wand and resources were no issue at all, who would you want to attract to these issues about keeping the world safe from nuclear catastrophe and hopefully moving us closer to disarmament? So that could be anybody, any sector, any partner at all. Who would you most want us to attract? So first, Leslie, the question is, what have you heard from somebody else? We start with you, and then I'm going to go around. Leslie, Brian, Tamara, Kate.
So I think for the first piece, for something that I've heard from someone else in this discussion, I love the idea of the front door that Tamara said, being able to more clearly attract the broader population, non-experts, into this debate and drawing on their ideas. I think that's crucial. And in terms of being able to wave a wand and make a change in order to attract a new partner, I feel like greater cooperation between the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are crucial for this. I think that nuclear entrepreneurs and reactor designers are extremely motivated to develop designs that are inherently proliferation resistant, just because it opens a broader market for us in addition to clearly being the right thing to do. But we need the ability to test and prototype and commercialize these reactors on a rapid scale within 5 to 10 years within this country so that the tech doesn't have to go overseas.
Okay, got it. Great. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, so I really identified with Peter's quick intervention on the need to solve big problems with big solutions, and the need to have a truly revolutionary big idea that will really help manage this this problem. With one caveat that while I think that is the search for the silver bullet, if you will, should be all of our objectives, that we also need to understand that we face a threat today, and that we need to also, while we are scanning the horizon for the big solution, we need to be pragmatic in terms of meeting and addressing the challenges that we can address with the toolkit that we have. And secondly, just in terms of who else we should have around the table, as I engage with private industry in virtually any sector in the technology innovation space that Leslie sits in the space in terms of manufacturers and innovation that Tamara comments on in the communications industry, and pick your space that is a component of that global proliferation supply chain. The financial industry controls it all, and that we all have at least some relationship with the financial sector. And they have, in my estimation, a truly unique ability to positively incent and motivate change in behavior on all of our parts. And so I think identifying ways that we can develop a common interest set with the financial sector, to me, is really critical.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, how about you, Tamara, and then Kate?
Sure. I think I really appreciated learning from Kate more about the growth process of TEDx and how it was built and how they went from being a small grassroots organization to having this massive following. And I appreciated learning about the strategy that's behind organizing these types of talks and the very specific structure that goes into formulating language to be accessible to the public and to be compelling to the public. Because I think that's, and when you talk about alphabet soup, I think the field of nuclear security is one of the worst ones out there. Like, it's a completely different language, and a lot of it is just, it really turns people off when you don't find a way to connect it to the challenges of the everyday public and to the security of the everyday public. So thank you, Kate, for that. In terms of waving a magic wand, I agree with Brian that there's no silver bullet solution for this, but in terms of my field, I would really, really like to see more being done in accessing the resources and the capabilities we see developing in commercial satellite imagery. I think it's an incredible capability that largely has not been incorporated simply because when the international agreements that we have surrounding non-proliferation were negotiated, satellite imagery just did not exist in the form that it does today. And again, it continues to advance exponentially. And I think in terms of being able to observe the facilities that would be relevant for verifying non-proliferation and for future arms control and disarmament measures, as well as for basically being able to deter on a wider basis potential proliferation activity, with the knowledge that there is going to be an archive of satellite imagery updated every 24 hours of the entire globe. I think that's an incredible capability when we talk about moving forward and progressing toward that timeline, toward disarmament. And I would hope that we can get more actors from that area involved.
Okay, thanks for that thoughtful answer. And how about you, Kate, to close us up on this? Oh, but actually, then I'm going to come to you, Pete. I want to hear your thoughts on this too.
I was really interested in hearing from Brian about how do you pinpoint where that intersection that would incentivize more private partners to come on board. And then in terms of who we want to get involved, I mean, I'm biased, I'm coming from TED, but I keep thinking about who are the individuals who have a message that's really compelling that people want to listen to. I think there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that needs to happen, but I think that there's a public element and a little, starting a movement around it is really important, and you need a really compelling person with a message to communicate it.
Okay. All right. So Pete Leiden.
Well, I just want to say quick, because I know we're ending here, but I really like Leslie's insight about how close we could be to actually reshifting around a massive shift in our energy towards climate change. I hold great hope. I mean, my thing I would just say, which is a little, we all don't really mention this, but the one thing I think that could really dramatically shift things in this space is if we had another nuclear device go off someplace. And I think you hate to go into that negative scenario, but if that happened, I would say many things could happen very fast, and including alignment of industry, a shifting through of regulations, a very different kind of shifting of what's going on here. Now, again, that's the last, you don't want to go that scenario, but I will say it's a scenario. And if that happens, I think we could move really fast. I also think if another threat like climate change really becomes so obvious, it could actually shift things fast. So anyhow, I hold out hope that big shifts are on the horizon and possible, but I hope we don't go down the negative scenario. But I will say, I do think things can move fast in the next 10, 20 years here. So with that, I would say back to you, and I hope you wrap it up, Erica.
Yes, I will. So with that, let me just say that our fervent hope is that we won't have to go through the scenario of some kind of nuclear catastrophe to get to the point where we see a real resurgence of interest in these issues. And we think it's possible that there are other ways to attract partners of all kinds to help us make the world safer and more secure around nuclear risk, and in fact to get us to disarmament goals over in our lifetime, to use that phrase. We put a man on the moon when we decided to do that. There's no reason we can't do this. So with that, I just want to thank you all for joining us, and we have lots to think about. Thanks so much, everybody.